In 2026, health won't just be measured by giving up alcohol or how much kale you can pile onto your plate. The new healthy, I think, in 2026 is going to be measured quietly, invisibly, in your browser history, your screen time, your ability to close a tab and not feel anxious about what you're missing. It'll show up whether you still read real books with real pages or whether you'll scroll until your mind goes numb. The big mental health trend of 2026 is going to be how much you can control where your attention goes. We're entering the age of content dieting, a moment where restraint has replaced consumption as the ultimate signal of control, where choosing not to watch, not to click, not to know has become the new flex. Restriction, once the language of bodily wellness, has migrated up into our minds. But why? Because I think for more than a decade, we've treated the internet like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Infinite feeds, infinite takes, infinite urgency. We've learned to equate awareness with worth. If I see every meme, if I know every news story, if I know every cultural talking point, I'm on the ball. The more I know, the more valuable I am, the better I am, the more informed I have become. But I think something has changed in 2026. I think abundance, when it comes to content, has reached a breaking point. And I think we're all there. Social media burnout has become depressingly familiar. Brain rot is now an acceptable part of just being a person online. Digital detoxes are almost boringly normal. We've seen too much. We've consumed everything. And just as food culture swung from indulgence to optimization, information culture, I believe in 2026 is going to do the same. We're no longer going to ask what's going on. We're going to ask what's worth even knowing. So people are going to start cleansing. They're going to start curating. Well, they already are starting to do that. And I'm going to talk about that in this week's video. You can see people bragging about newsletters instead of news cycles, about small reading groups they're part of instead of endlessly being online in viral threads. Statements like, I deleted Instagram, are no longer going to become a cry for help. They're going to become like a pitch, a resume line, proof of your discipline, proof of the taste that you have. But the thing that I'm going to argue in this video is that none of this is purely neutral. None of this is just about mental health, because content diets, which I think are going to be big this year, say just as much about our relationship with technology as they do about our relationship with class, power, and permission. And I'm going to explain. So to frame this argument, or to sort of give it its kind of intellectual heft, I'm going to be referring a lot to the work of French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu. He's great, and I think you should read him if you want to read something of his. He has a book called Distinction, which a lot of this thinking is inspired by. And basically what Pierre Bourdieu argued in the 70s and 80s and 90s is that when access becomes universal, distinction goes somewhere else. It goes to taste, restraint, and the ability to say no to something. What does that look like in 2026? Well, in a world where information has become free, instant, and increasingly AI generated, discernment becomes an elitist trope. The new highbrow isn't about knowing more, it's about knowing what to ignore. And content dieting is at the heart of that. It's not just about self-care, although I'll explain how the benefits are very clear that we spend less time online. But it's already become a form of cultural capital, because when everyone else is drowning in machine-made noise, the truly privileged are going quiet. They're reading physical books, they're sharing private lists, they're being unreachable on purpose, flexing the one resource that we can't automate or optimize or scale: sustained attention. In 2026, focus is going to become the new financial independence, and silence, real silence, is going to become the most expensive asset you have. Before I dive deep into the politics and the power and the cultural significance of all of this, it's really important for me to say that spending less time online is definitely a good thing. At its simplest, content restriction works because your nervous system was never designed to be always on, always consuming, always interpreting. Our brains evolved to handle bursts of information, not a constant drip of alerts, updates, outrage, and social comparison. And the research confirms what we've already felt for a very long time. When you reduce the flow of information, things calm down. Studies that look at digital restriction consistently show modest but real improvements in well-being when people limit their exposure, especially to social media and breaking news. Less scrolling, we know, correlates with less loneliness, less depressive symptoms, fewer anxiety spikes, not because the internet is an evil thing that you should be avoiding at all costs, but because just endless unfiltered feeds keep our minds in a low-grade state of vigilance. We're always scanning, always reacting. And this is what content dieting actually does at a physiological level. It lowers our cognitive load. It reduces the number of emotional jolts our brain has to process. It creates space where attention can settle instead of ricochet. But before I go on, you're probably thinking, isn't this just digital detoxing and you've just given it a fancy new word? I argue that digital detoxing is a form of content dieting in that you are choosing not to engage in technology. But the goal of a detox is a gap, a break. Ultimately, you're still returning to what you consumed before. Content dieting, as what I'm going to try and explain, is more of a catch-all term for what is going to become a diverse field of restriction of content. And that restriction is going to be defined by demographics, gender, personal beliefs. I'll get into that in a bit, but let's go back to why spending less time online is a good thing. The benefits of restricting our access to content especially amplifies around news consumption, because doom scrolling isn't just a meme, it's a stress pattern. Psychological research and clinical reporting link heavy exposure to negative news cycles with high levels of anxiety, despair, and a perception that things are always about to go wrong. Because when every spare moment is filled with catastrophe, the nervous system never gets the signal that it's safe to stand down. So people should set boundaries, they should unfollow, they should time limit. We should find more curated ways of accessing information because we know it's good for us. But content dieting isn't just about mental health, I'm arguing. It's also about cultural beliefs. And the best way to explain that is to look at what happened to food. Back in the day when food was scarce, the goal was eating more, consuming more. We've seen throughout history that decadence and wealth was correlated with how much food you could procure, or how much food you could make someone else cook for you, how much food you could present at eating at dinners, at buffets, at occasions, right? We've seen that. But then when calories became abundant, eating better became the new norm, the new flex. But then something else happened after that. Eating less became the new gold standard. Diet culture didn't just stop at moderation. It wasn't just healthy eating. It became splintered into increasingly specific forms of restriction. Paleo, juice cleanses, intermittent fasting, keto. You know these groups because they now are solidified as defined social characteristics. Each one isn't just promising that you will lose weight, it's offering a form of mastery, it's offering a form of discipline and even identity. And the logic of these splinters, these factions around diet culture was the same. Modern abundance is regarded as unnatural, and restriction restores some form of purity. And content diets follow the same arc. First comes awareness. I'm on my phone too much. Then moderation, screen time limits, apps that block your apps. Then specialization, no social media, but podcasts are fine. No news, but long form essays are great. AI summaries only. Physical books only. Newsletters I trust. Nothing else. Restriction doesn't disappear, it fractures. And just like what happened with food culture, the restrictions themselves start to take on a meaning of their own. They signal values, they signal intelligence, they signal that you're not overwhelmed, but you're in control. The point isn't that content is literally food, it's that both live inside systems of abundance engineered for overconsumption. Both create empty calories, stimulation without nourishment, and both produce the same cultural response, I believe. A turn towards discipline, curation, and the performance of restraint, which is why content dieting, as it will emerge more completely in 2026, won't just stabilize at use your phone less. It's going to keep evolving into finer and finer distinctions. How you restrict will matter more than what you restrict. What you allow in will become a bigger part of who you think you are, in just the same way as food did in the 90s and 2000s. So we know that spending less time in feeds has benefits, and we can also see that, like food, there is a well-trodden path where content diets can feature or fracture into different ideas, subcultures and forms of expression. But restriction doesn't operate evenly across society. Choosing less requires security, time, confidence that nothing catastrophic will happen if you don't respond immediately. For those whose livelihoods depend on constant availability, gig workers, service employees, precarious professionals, abundance is not an option. It's compulsory, which is why restriction, I believe, will begin to signal not just wellness, but also ideas around power. Because in an age where everyone can access everything, the ability to opt out becomes the new elite. The new aspiration isn't knowing more than others, it's needing less. And as content continues to just endlessly scale beyond our capacity to consume it, that distinction will only sharpen. Restriction, once a response to scarcity, has become the luxury of abundance. This is where the moment content dieting crosses from just a mental health practice into identity, where how you restrict starts to matter more than the restriction itself. Just as food culture splintered into its recognizable tribes, the paleo people, the fasting people, the cleansing people, content restriction will start to harden into formats that signal who you are and where you belong. And the most obvious example is just lists, curated reading lists, podcast short lists, what I read instead of the news threads. You've seen them already, they already exist. They're not neutral recommendations, they're declarations, a list that says this is what counts. And an environment with AI-generated summaries and hot takes and recycled insights, the act of curating becomes an assertion of authority. You're not just consuming less, you're defining a version of legitimacy that will become tribal with time. And we know this. We know this because research on cultural capital, again, a Bordeaux concept, you should go and have a look at that, helps us understand why this matters. Because when information becomes abundant and cheap, the value shifts from access to what can be filtered. Knowing what to ignore becomes as important as knowing what to absorb. Lists functions as shortcuts to the wise, compressed signals of discernment that separate the serious thinkers from the passive scrollers. After that will come the clubs, private reading groups, invite-only discords, paid newsletters, where the comment sections feel more like considered salons than chaotic feeds. And these places replace scale with intimacy and speed with slowness. And unlike algorithmic platforms that are designed to maximize your engagement, your attention, just extracting everything out of you, these communities are going to be defined by friction, paywalls, invitations, time commitments, long-form discussions. And that friction, that's the point of all this. And we know this because in sociological research on digital inequality, it shows that the participation in slower, deeper forms of media engagement correlates strongly with education, income, and occupational stability. Now, that's a mouthful. I'm going to unpack that a little bit. Deep reading, long conversations, and offline intellectual life require time and free time, and I don't have anything more pressing to do than this thing right here. But that concept, that free time, that luxury is not evenly distributed across class, gender, income, race, all these sorts of things, right? Your ability to have the free time to dedicate to curating information on what you read correlates with how wealthy you are. Time-poor people with a lack of job insecurity and bills to pay can't dedicate precious time to reading a 3,000-word essay like this video is based on. The ability to participate signals not just your interests, but your insulation from the precarity that other people feel. And this is how content diets, I think, are going to become a form of virtue signaling. Physical books instead of PDFs, printed reading lists instead of bookmarks, dumb phones instead of productivity apps. Yep, the likes of Anna Wintour, Rihanna, and a slew of unrecognizable but exceedingly wealthy people, from CEOs to bank owners, from owners of basketball teams, all opt to use phones that come from the 2000s. Why? Because someone else is doing the heavy lifting. Someone else is always online on your behalf. The flex here is the restriction. And even silence itself, I think, will become stylized. A deliberate absence will be framed as intention rather than neglect. These choices mirror what scholars describe as slow media practices, where how we engage with content like this rejects speed and scale and immediacy in favour of depth and reflection. But just like with food culture, identity-driven restriction has a darker side. Once a particular form of restraint becomes associated with intelligence or virtue, its absence starts to read as failure. Those who have to rely on algorithmic feeds because they lack time, training, or access are going to become framed as undisciplined rather than constrained. Mass culture will become junk, and depth will become moralized. And this is where I think content dieting stops being just about mental health and starts becoming about social hierarchy. The question will shift from what helps people feel better to what counts as legitimate engagement. There'll be an arbitration of taste and what is good content versus bad content. And I think the danger with that is the people who will define what's good and what's bad will be the people who can access it. So what am I trying to say? Restriction, in other words, doesn't just calm the mind, it redraws, I think, a map. In a world where everyone is drowning in information, the people who appear most in control will be the ones who seem the most untouched by it. And the quiet consensus forming in 2026 is this: if your attention is scattered, it won't just be seen as unhealthy, it will be seen as unsophisticated. And that's how I think a coping mechanism becomes a cultural filter. So if this is all true and my sparkling prediction is right, where does this go? Where do we end up? If content dieting becomes a thing and it becomes a kind of arbiter of taste and sophistication, well, I think it becomes something about inequality. I think everyone who chooses to be offline will benefit from the effects of not being online, but there are people who cannot afford to not be online. And as digital restriction becomes a status symbol, a quiet divide will open up between two very different forms of disconnection. On the one side, you have the people who opt out, who step away from feeds, who mute notifications and treat unreachability as a form of self-mastery. Then on the other hand, there are people who are pushed out by things like unstable access, stolen devices, unpaid data plans, or systems that require constant connectivity just to survive. This is what researchers have increasingly called the disconnection divide, the growing gap between voluntary, privileged disengagement and involuntary, precarious disconnection. So all of this builds on decades of digital divide research, but it's kind of like an inverted version of it. The original concept around the digital divide focused on who lacked access and therefore who lacked access to what our economies were becoming. The disconnection divide, however, is asking a way harder question about who is able to disconnect safely and who isn't, because in 2026 connectivity isn't optional infrastructure. It's how you apply for jobs, it's how you receive benefits from the government, it's how you access healthcare, it's how you coordinate work shifts, it's how you maintain social ties. For many people, being offline doesn't restore calm, it actually creates a sense of risk. Missed messages might mean missed income. Missed updates might mean missed care. And studies on digital inequality consistently show that lower income and precariously employed groups are often the least able to reduce their digital engagement, even when they experience the highest levels of digital stress. Their lives are structured around responsiveness. Availability isn't a choice, it's a requirement of life, which is why chosen disconnection carries so much symbolic power. When a well-resourced individual announces they're offline for a week, it reads as intentional, grounded, aspirational. But when a marginalised person disappears from the network, it reads as failure, neglect, or instability. The same behaviour is interpreted in opposite ways, not because of intent, but because of status. And this is where content dieting reveals its edge. As restriction becomes morally coded, as I think it will, as disciplined, enlightened and high status, constant connectivity becomes pathologized. The always-on worker isn't seen as constrained, they're seen as addicted. The person glued to their phone isn't interpreted as navigating precarity, they're framed as just having no self-control. Mental health language often, always, I'd argue, gets weaponized. And what begins as a legitimate attempt, in this case, to spend less time online, to look after ourselves better, just becomes another way to sort people. The calm and curated versus the frantic and the flooded, the offline elite versus the hyper-connected poor, analog capital versus algorithmic survival. This matters because mental health doesn't exist outside of material conditions. Disconnection improves well-being only when it's chosen. When it's forced, it compounds exclusion. The same silence that restores focus for one person can deepen isolation for another. So as content diets roll out in 2026, as I reckon it will, the curated media, reading the slow media, the digital absence becoming a measure of success, the question we need to ask ourselves isn't whether restriction works, it's who gets to do it. In a culture that increasingly equates calm with competence, the freedom to disengage may be the most unequal mental health resource of all. Let's just get one thing really clear as I try to sort of summarize where we've got to in this video. Spending less time online is definitely good for you. The research is clear. Reduced digital overload eases anxiety, softens our nervous system, restores a sense of agency over our absolutely frazzled attention. Boundaries around content help us sleep better, think more clearly, and feel less perpetually on edge. In a culture optimized for interruption, disconnection can and is genuinely quite healing. But mental health is never a thing that can be sliced neatly. The mistake we make with all of these mental health trends isn't believing that logging off helps. The mistake is believing that logging off is just a personal choice, a switch you can flip in isolation from the rest of your life. Mental health doesn't live in just one behavior, one act. It lives in how behaviors attach themselves to your identity, your status, belonging, and your sense of meaning. Content diets won't change what we consume. It will change how we see ourselves, what we read, what we choose to ignore, how reachable we are, how quietly we respond. These choices will signal competence, taste, and legitimacy. They will shape how we show up socially and professionally, and they'll quietly declare in front of us what sort of person we're trying to be. But when content restriction becomes aspirational, it stops being this neutral wellness practice, and it starts to become something we want to show to other people. That's not a reason to reject it at all. It's a reason to be more curious about it than just the idea of spending time offline is a good thing. And the reason why I believe that is just as food culture taught us that eating less very quickly became very little about health and more about things like morality and discipline and belonging. Content culture is teaching us the same lesson at a cognitive level. The risk is never in the restriction itself. The risk is forgetting that restriction always carries meaning, and meaning always carries power. When we frame content diets as just a therapeutic tool, we miss the ways it can slip into something else. We miss when we treat disconnection as a universal solution. We ignore the structural realities that make constant connectivity unavoidable for so many a problem. And when we moralize focus, calm, and slowness, we risk turning mental health into just another measuring stick to measure our self-worth. The healthier frame, I think, for all this isn't about less content will fix all my problems. It's more about what does my relationship to information tell me about how I live at the moment. I think in this year, the 2026 crazy mad year that I'm sure it will be, the question isn't whether we should spend less time offline, less time online. We absolutely should spend less time online. The question is whether we can hold two truths at once. That disconnection can be deeply beneficial, but our ability to do that comes with a load of baggage that has socioeconomic things like class, gender, race, and status wrapped up in it. Mental health doesn't live outside these things. I know so many people in this profession believe it does. I believe mental health moves through all of those things. And if the new luxury is really saying no, then the real work isn't just learning when to log off, it's understanding what that refusal means, who it serves, and ultimately who has permission to do it.